Hello, Alex here, and in this video I want to talk about the results of my very small scale developer test for Rollei's IR400 super panchromatic infrared sensitive film, which I did using Kodak HC-110, Rodinal and Kodak Xtol. I know a lot of you are probably not here to hear about the rationale or the testing methodology or any of that kind of thing. For those of you, there's the timestamp to go straight to the pictures. Otherwise, let's get into it. So let's nip the obvious question in the bud straight off the bat. Why only 3 developers? Mainly, I only had 4 at the time: HC-110, Rodinal, Xtol and D76. The reason I didn't use D76 for this test is that IR400 in sheet film format has a really thin base at 100 microns or 0.1 millimeters. Most sheet films other than this are usually in the region of 170 to 180 microns, 0.17 to 0.18 millimeters. They are much more rigid and sturdy. This film is very flimsy and floppy. So when using inversion agitation in a 3-rail Patterson tank with the Mod 54, it just falls off the reel. And if you do more than 2 sheets at a time, they end up getting stuck to each other. One of the sheets doesn't get developed in each half of the tank. You're lucky if they don't end up in a big clump. It's a mess. So I use the swizzle stick agitation method for this film in 4x5. But that doesn't work with D76. D76 requires much more vigorous and random agitation to get good results. I did actually try this for one other film and you can see the results here. It looks horrible, the surge marks are everywhere. So I'm not doing it for this film and it's not part of this test. If you were to do this in roll film format, I'm sure it would work well, but that's just not financially feasible. Sheets cost much less than an entire roll, so that's kind of one of the limitations of this. I was using the developers that work well with my setup, and I'm sharing the results of that with you. So a few months ago, I shot this film for the first time on a day out with Patrick and Mark. Mark shot his roll of this stuff in 120, I shot a roll in 35, as did Patrick, and I shot 4 sheets in 4x5. I developed mine and Mark's rolls and my sheets in HC-110 Dilution B, and Patrick developed his roll in the GOAT Xtol. Patrick's shots looked so much better in 35mm than Mark's did in 120, and not far off what mine did in 4x5, within, you know, the realm of exaggeration and hyperbole. My 35mm roll looked like absolute crap, and I really wasn't that convinced that it was just the developer could make such a difference. I mean, it's not a T-grain film, so surely the developer couldn't make that much of a difference, right? So I had the box of 4x5 sheets and I wanted to test the developers that I had that I could use with swizzle stick agitation, just to see if it really is a HC-110 problem with this film or if there was something else that I was missing. The camera and lens used were the Wister 45 RF with the Schneider 135mm f5.6 SIMR set to f11 to minimize the effects of diffraction on the infrared images in particular, and I metered using the Sekonic L758D. For each developer, I shot 2 photographs, one in the visible spectrum with no filter at EI400, underexposed by a stop just to protect the highlights and because I didn't really care about the deepest, darkest shadows. The second image was shot with the Heliopan 715 nanometer infrared filter at EI25 and metered as normal. Each pair of images was then developed in its respective developer at 20 degrees Celsius in the Jobo TBE2 for the amount of time recommended for that dilution on the box. This turned out to be a total disaster because Rollei's times are not just inconsistent from, like, you know, Retro 400S to IR400, which are probably the same film anyway, but from format to format, on the boxes or in the canisters, they give you completely different times for the same film, for the same developer, at the same dilution, at the same temperature. It's absolute nonsense, and I can't believe I didn't realize that before I actually did this testing. In reality, this doesn't make much difference for the Xtol or Rodinal, but it does mean that the HC-110 images are overcooked by about 1.5 to 2 stops, depending on whether you follow the 20 or 30% rule for pushing a stop. The actual dilutions that I chose were chosen to be as neutral as possible. For HC-110, dilution B is pretty much the de facto dilution. For Rodinal, I chose 1+25 because the times were just shorter, but 1+50 I'm sure would work well. Xtol, if you're not pushing your film using Xtol, you should probably be using stock Xtol and using the replenishment method. No idea what I'm talking about? Check out Patrick's video. In each case, I used 1 liter of developer, which is admittedly a lot for 2 sheets, but at least this error in the ratio of developer to film is constant across all 3 tests, so that can be ignored. Development was halted using Ilford Ilfostop at 1+19 for just 10 seconds, and then the images were fixed using Ilford Rapid Fixer at 1+9 for 8 minutes at 20 degrees Celsius. 3 minutes of washing was carried out using 18 degrees Celsius tap water, followed by a quick dip and dunk in some Kodak Photo Flow just before hanging them to dry. Then the images were scanned in using the 1DX Mark III and the 100mm f2.8 IS USM macro lens. I nearly got that first time for once. As a 6-shot panorama, which I stitched in Adobe Lightroom. Then in Adobe Lightroom, I prepared 2 copies of each image. The first one is just me playing around with the exposure slider and the black and white point as you normally would, and these are the images that I've been using the whole way through. There was no other post-processing done to those images, no sharpening, contrast, dehaze, clarity, nothing like that whatsoever. I don't think I even dusted them. I know that the Xtol negatives are scratched because I dropped them on the floor. I certainly didn't go to the effort of cloning those out because it's not really important. Then for the second batch of images, I expanded out the histogram to about 90% of the width of the histogram window and then set the black and white points, which disregards the Dmax in the negatives and just gives us a better idea, albeit exaggerated, of the natural contrast within each negative, which is separate from density, and it's hard to discern that from just looking at the negatives. These images are just a qualitative representation of the natural contrast in each negative and doesn't represent the actual dynamic range within them. It just gives you a vague idea because, you know, for certain applications, having too much contrast in the negative is actually a bad thing. For the actual results, I'm just going to shut up and show you a quick clip of the negatives on a light table, then look at the versions of the images that I prepared to show off the native contrast of each negative, separate from the density again, and then just go through various points around my test scenes in visible and infrared from the actual test images. So what can you and I learn from these results? The fact that the HC-110 images were basically pushed to 1.5 or more isn't ideal, and it does throw off the absolute, authenticity of these results quite a bit, but c'est la vie. I still don't think HC-110 is a great developer, whether it's developed relatively okay or pushed. That nasty grain structure is there, and I still don't know if it's called grain structure, if that's the right term. If it's not, let me know in the comments down below, please. But it still doesn't look nice. There's good contrast, but the actual acutance and resolution are pretty much masked by the patterning in the grain, whether it's masking fine detail in a detailed part of the scene, or whether it's something with very faint or coarse detail where there's not really much going on, like the plain surface of a leaf, it becomes patterned and almost dirty looking, and I still really don't like it. Rodinal gives a wonderfully nice image with really high acutance and good resolution, but the contrast is very high, and I'm normally shooting infrared film on a very bright sunny day with lots of light, and that might just be too much, so it's not going to be very forgiving. Rodinal 1+50 would be a lot better in this regard, but I didn't test that because the official times were far too long, so I went with 1+25. Yeah, maybe it might be better, but I can't say how much better 1+50 would be than 1+25. I might play around with Rodinal 1+25 and 1+50 for shooting this film as a pan-chromatic film, just without an IR filter, because it can be pushed and pulled quite a bit and it might be quite nice to mess around with there. But for infrared, probably not going to be my jam. Definitely not a bad developer, just not to my tastes, mainly because of the contrast. In my opinion, Xtol is obviously the winner. It has absolutely amazing resolution, super fine grain with no nasty patterning or anything worth noting whatsoever in that regard. But it also has really nice dynamic range and contrast, being able to retain detail in the shadows while bringing back those highlights just a little bit in the negative, which preserves detail and just gives you a wonderful negative to actually work with in post-production, at least for a scanning workflow. It might be a bit too flat for a darkroom workflow. I don't know. I haven't actually shot any of this stuff in smaller formats in Xtol yet, so I haven't been able to try it in the darkroom, but at least for a digital workflow, I think Xtol is absolutely the way to go, at least of these three developers. And probably in general, Xtol's amazing, you should try it. So yeah, this is all very subjective, but what do you think? Which of these looks best for this film in your opinion? Is the technical term really grain structure? Let me know in the comments down below, and if you have any suggestions for sheet films that are, decently affordable, please don't say T-Max, that you would like me to try out with this kind of methodology, obviously with other developers if they have a thicker base, like D76 or maybe something a little better that I may have picked up during the week. Let me know in the comments down below. That's it for this video then. Stay safe, and bye-bye for now. If you don't already, follow me on Instagram at Shaka1277 for new pictures every day. If you like this video and enjoy what I do on the channel, please consider subscribing or checking out my Patreon, where the tiers start at just €1 per month.